Imagine flying high above Germany in 1943. The sky is bright, but death hides in every cloud. You're a German fighter pilot, your Messerschmitt engine screaming, your finger resting on the trigger. And below you, you see it, a broken American bomber limping home, smoke curling from its engines. It's helpless. It's your enemy. It's your chance for another victory. But something inside you whispers, don't. This is the story of Franz Stigler, the Luftwaffe pilot who pointed his guns at a dying B-17 bomber and then decided to do something no one expected. He refused to kill. He refused to obey. Franz Stigler wasn't born a hero. He was just a boy who loved the sky. Growing up in Bavaria, he built model planes, stared at the clouds, and dreamed of flying one day. His father had been a pilot in World War I, and by the time Franz turned 20, flying had become his life. Before the war, he flew commercial planes for Lufthansa. But when the Second World War began, everything changed. He joined the Luftwaffe, Germany's powerful air force, and the dream of flight quickly turned into a mission of survival. The sky over Europe became a battlefield. Flames, smoke, tracer bullets. Every day, pilots took off, not knowing if they would return. Franz quickly proved himself. He was skilled, fast, and fearless. He downed Allied bombers one after another. His commanders saw a rising ace, maybe even a future Knight's Cross winner. But behind those cold medals, something human still lived inside him. He wasn't a machine. He still believed in honor, in a code that said, even in war, there are limits. Then came December 20th, 1943, the day that would test that code forever. Far away in England, a young American pilot named Charlie Brown climbed into his Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Ye Olde Pub. It was his first combat mission. He was only 21. His target? The Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, Germany. As the bombers crossed into German airspace, the sky exploded with black puffs of flak. Shrapnel tore through aluminum skin. The pub shook violently. One engine went out, then another. The nose cone was ripped away. Oxygen systems failed. Crewmen were hit, one killed instantly. Blood freezing on the metal floor. When the bombing run ended, Brown tried to turn back toward England, but his fortress was falling apart. Hundreds of miles from safety, every gun turret destroyed, engines coughing smoke, his crew wounded and half-conscious from the freezing air. It was the kind of plane German pilots called easy meat. Franz Stigler was refueling at an airfield near Bremen when the alarm sirens howled. He jumped into his Messerschmitt Bf 109, heart racing, adrenaline burning. He'd already shot down 2 bombers that day. One more, and he would earn the coveted Knight's Cross. He climbed into the sky, scanning for targets. Then he saw it, the lone B-17, staggering across the clouds like a wounded bird. This one's mine, he thought. He dove behind the bomber, lined up his guns, ready to fire. But just as he was about to squeeze the trigger, something made him pause. The tail gunner wasn't shooting. That was strange. He moved closer, closer than any pilot normally dared. What he saw next froze him. The B-17's tail was shredded. The gunner was slumped motionless over his weapon. Through the holes in the fuselage, Franz could see the crew inside, bloody, exhausted, trying desperately to keep the aircraft alive. They weren't fighters anymore. They were survivors. In that instant, Franz remembered the words of his old commander, Gustav Rodel. "If I ever see you shooting at a man in a parachute, I'll shoot you myself." This wasn't combat anymore. This was execution. Franz eased his finger off the trigger. He couldn't do it. He pulled up alongside the bomber's wing. Inside, Charlie Brown and his co-pilot stared in disbelief. A German fighter right next to them, but it wasn't firing. Franz gestured with his hands. He pointed down, trying to signal them to land in Germany and surrender. Brown shook his head. They were heading home. Franz sighed. He knew if he let them go, he could be court-martialed, even shot for treason. The Luftwaffe code was clear.
The enemy dies. But his conscience was louder than the rules. He decided to protect them instead. He flew beside the crippled bomber, positioning his Messerschmitt so German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground would see the two planes together and hold their fire. Any German watching from below would think he was escorting a damaged friendly aircraft. Charlie Brown's crew, terrified, watched as the B-109 stayed with them all the way to the coast, not firing, not leaving, just watching, guarding. When they reached the North Sea, Franz knew he had to turn back. He saluted the American pilot, a small gesture, but one that meant everything. Then he banked his plane away and vanished into the clouds. Inside the bomber, Brown sat stunned. He didn't understand what had just happened. An enemy had spared them, protected them even. The crew sat in silence as they crossed the water, engine sputtering, until finally they landed back in England. When they climbed out of the wrecked bomber, mechanics couldn't believe it had made it home. More than 200 bullet holes, one engine gone, tail shredded, wings torn, but all 9 surviving crew members were alive.
Brown reported the incident to his superiors, but they ordered him to keep quiet. The story didn't fit wartime propaganda. Commanders didn't want soldiers thinking the enemy had mercy. The report was buried, and for decades, nobody spoke of it again. On the other side of the war, Franz Stigler told no one either. He kept his secret for 45 years. After the war ended, he lost his country, his comrades, his career. He emigrated to Canada and started a new life. But he never forgot the bomber he didn't shoot. Then, in the late 1980s, Charlie Brown decided to find the German pilot who spared him. He wrote letters, searched veteran networks, asked every pilot he could find, until finally, one day, a letter arrived. It was from Franz Stigler. When they met face-to-face in 1990, both men cried. 2 enemies who should have killed each other. Standing together, alive because one man chose compassion. Franz said, "I love you, Charlie." Charlie replied, "I owe you my life." From that day on, they became like brothers. They visited each other often, spent holidays together, and shared their story with the world. When Franz Stigler died in 2008, Charlie Brown passed away just a few months later, as if their friendship had one final flight to take together. Their story became known through the book A Higher Call, and even inspired songs and documentaries. But more than anything, it became a reminder that in the darkest times, light can still exist. Franz Stigler had every reason to pull the trigger. He had lost friends, watched his cities burn, seen the worst of war. But at that moment, he saw not an enemy, just men fighting to live. It takes courage to kill in war, but it takes greater courage not to. That's why this story matters, because it proves that even when humanity is buried under hatred, it never truly dies. If you made it this far, remember this. One man's choice not to obey became a story the whole world still talks about today. And maybe that's the kind of victory that lasts forever. The years that followed the war were not kind to Franz Stigler. Germany lay shattered, its skies silent where once thundered the engines of Messerschmitts and bombers. Stigler returned home a decorated ace, but the victories felt hollow. He'd flown missions over Africa, Sicily, and the Reich, claiming dozens of aerial victories, yet what defined him would not be the tally of kills, but one unfired shot. In peacetime Germany, the war's old trophies were despised. Veterans struggled, factories were in ruins, the Luftwaffe no more. Stigler found work as a commercial pilot, flew for a time, but the memories haunted him. The bomber he let go, the wounded crew he spared, the sky-hooked moment of choice. His brother August, lost in the conflict, was a constant reminder of the cost of obedience.
In 1953, he left Germany for Canada. He settled quietly. He built a life far from the roar of engines and the glare of searchlights. He married, had children, worked, and rarely spoke of that December day in 1943. But inside, the incident, capital I, waited. It waited in his mind, in his heart, in the lines of every incalculable sunrise. Meanwhile, in the United States, Charlie Brown, the young pilot who flew Ye Olde Pub that day, also returned home. Haunted by what his crew had endured, the flak, the ripping wings, the death of the tail gunner, the wounded friends, he survived the war, went on to a longer life of service, yet he carried the memory of the bomber's fragility, of the impossible mercy shown. Over the decades, Brown wondered, who was the German pilot? Who spared us? He searched, kept notes, asked veterans, dug into records. For years, he found nothing. The story remained classified. The Luftwaffe kept its own silence. Germany's post-war identity made the incident awkward. It was not glory. It was chivalry. And chivalry in war is quiet. In 1990, the two men finally met. Brown traveled to Vancouver, Canada. Stieg welcomed him. They embraced. Former adversaries turned friends. The two men looked at the skies they once ruled, the bomber and the fighter, the roaring engines and the silence after. They spoke of duty, of regret, of mercy. They laughed and cried. They told the story they had carried alone for decades. At that meeting, they agreed, this isn't a story about good and evil. It's a story about choice. The moment when a pilot said, this is not worth killing. The moment when a bomber crew said, we will fight to survive, not to kill. The moment when war paused long enough for humanity to peek through. In the years that followed, the incident became legend. A book, A Higher Call, told it in full. The B-17 Ye Olde Pub, repainted and refurbished, flies again in remembrance. Museums display the cracked fuselage, the frozen gunner's turret. Veteran talks describe the moment, a Messerschmitt's habit of death turned into escort of life. But in real life, the consequences were subtle. Stiegler received letters. Some called him traitor. Some called him hero. Some didn't understand. In Canada, his neighbors asked why a German pilot would refuse to fight. He answered, because I saw them as wounded men, because I remembered the code, because I could not shoot. It was simple. It was terrifying. It was everything. Brown too lived the legacy. In later years, he flew reunion flights, spoke to young pilots, told them the story, if you see a man in a parachute, don't shoot. If you see a bomber falling, engines dead, pause. The war will ask many things of you, but even war should not ask for the destruction of the defenseless. Their friendship lasted until both men passed away in 2008, just months apart. The war that once set them against each other ended in a shared memory of mercy. Today, when you walk through a war museum, you might pass the B-17, battered, its nose cone missing, the holes in fuselage still visible. You might read the plaque describing the incident above the sky of Germany, December 20th, 1943. You might see the Messerschmitt silhouette and the B-17 wingtip held together. And you'll see this, not a dogfight, not a victory, not an obituary. A moment.
If you were the pilot, what would you have done? Press the trigger and claim the victory? Or look into the shattered crew and choose silence? That question stays. It travels beyond the war, beyond the machines, beyond the medals. Because in the end, the choice defines the man. I'll continue the next segment of the script shortly and expand further into their post-war reconciliation, the broader lessons for humanity, the memories of the crew, and how the incident resonates today. Even after decades, the image of that shattered bomber haunted Franz Stiegler. He would wake in the night, heart pounding, imagining the creaking metal, the frostbitten hands of the crew, the terrified eyes staring back at him through bullet-riddled glass. He often thought of the tail gunner, the young man who had already given his life, slumped over the turret. Franz wondered what he would have done if he had fired. Would his conscience have survived? Or would he have been just another cog in the war machine? Another killer with medals dangling from his chest? Stiegler's life in Canada was peaceful on the surface.
He became a commercial pilot again, flying cargo planes and small passenger flights. Neighbors knew him as polite, quiet, always ready to help. But inside, he carried the war. Not its glory, but its weight. Sometimes flying over the British Columbia mountains, he would picture a bomber struggling through the clouds, and he would remember a moment when he had chosen mercy over orders. It was a secret gift he carried alone, for fear of judgment. Meanwhile, Charlie Brown's life in the United States unfolded in a different rhythm. He married, raised children, and continued his career in aviation. But every time he saw a B-17 on display at an airshow or museum, he remembered the smell of smoke in the fuselage, the frozen silence of the wounded, and the improbable shadow of a German fighter flying beside them. The memory was bittersweet, a mix of fear, gratitude, and awe. The two men's eventual reunion in 1990 was more than just a meeting. It was a collision of decades of memory, grief, and reflection. When Brown stepped off the plane in Vancouver, he didn't know exactly what to expect. Would the man who spared them acknowledge the act? Would he deny it? When Franz appeared, older, lines edged deep into his face, eyes still holding the clarity of a young pilot. The moment was electric, yet quiet. They embraced like family members reunited after decades, strangers who had once shared the most intimate of human experiences, survival at the mercy of another. Their conversation lasted hours. They recounted every detail of that flight. Brown described the frozen air, the roar of the failing engines, the desperate prayers muttered in the cramped fuselage. Stiegler recalled his heart racing, the fear of court-martial, the inner argument between duty and conscience. Neither spoke of politics or ideology or who won the war. They spoke of men, human lives, and choices that echoed far beyond any battlefield. Over the next years, the friendship deepened. Stiegler and Brown became more than former enemies. They became ambassadors of conscience. They traveled together to reunions, speaking to young soldiers and pilots. They visited schools, telling students that courage was not always measured in combat or victory, but in restraint and moral choice. Their story was a living example that even in the darkest chapters of history, humanity could shine through. Franz Stiegler's other former comrades often asked him about his wartime record, expecting tales of victories, dogfights, or accolades. He deflected, rarely speaking of the incident. To him, it wasn't about medals. It was about what he refused to do. For Stiegler, the true victory was not measured in kills, but in the lives preserved by a single decision. A decision that defied orders, logic, and expectation.
Charlie Brown carried the memory of that day as a quiet guide. When decisions came under pressure, he often thought, what would Stiegler do? It shaped his life, his ethics, his understanding of bravery. The mercy shown in a moment of chaos became a moral compass that extended far beyond war. In later interviews, historians and journalists asked, why did he spare them? Was it a calculation? A strategic move? But the answer was simple and profoundly human. Franz Stiegler saw men in danger, not targets. He saw humanity, not enemies. And that simple choice reverberated through decades, through friendships, through lives saved. Museums now tell the story. Veterans recount the flight in lectures and documentaries. Pilots speak of it in simulators, imagining how one split-second choice could redefine history, morality, and even the bonds between men who are supposed to hate each other. The B-17, the fighter, the December sky, all frozen in memory, preserved in honor. Even today, the story resonates. It reminds us that courage is complex, morality is tested,
And humanity can emerge in the most unlikely places. Franz Stigler's name, once whispered in silence, now echoes in history as a symbol of conscience over compliance, choice over orders, mercy over destruction. And so, when we read about war, medals, and victories, we must remember that true heroism is sometimes invisible. The courage not to act, the bravery to protect, the wisdom to choose life over duty. Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown remind us of that truth. In war, in peace, in life, the greatest acts are often the quietest. A moment in the sky became a story for the ages, a testament to the human capacity for empathy, for courage, for conscience. And it began with one man looking at another, seeing not an enemy, but a fellow human being in peril, and saying simply, "Not today." After their reunion, Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown became more than friends. They became living proof that even the fiercest battles could leave room for humanity. They often reflected on how strange fate had been. Two young men, thrown into a global conflict, brought together not by camaraderie or shared nationality, but by an unspoken agreement forged in the skies. Their bond was quiet, profound, and built on mutual respect and gratitude. Franz continued to live a modest life in Canada, yet his story slowly began to seep into the public consciousness. Veterans groups, historians, and journalists sought him out. Some were curious, others incredulous. A man who had the chance to kill, to earn medals and glory, and instead chose mercy? It seemed almost fictional. Yet Franz did not boast. He described the flight with the simplicity of memory, never exaggerating, never embellishing. To him, it was just what he had to do. A moral obligation, not a headline. Charlie Brown, meanwhile, became an advocate for telling the untold stories of the war, the stories of honor, courage, and mercy that were overshadowed by carnage. He often spoke of the incident to young pilots, using it as a lesson that in the air, as in life, ethics matter. One of his favorite lines in speeches became, "Sometimes the bravest act is not firing your weapon, but keeping your humanity intact."
Their story inspired other veterans to share their moments of conscience, moments that had remained hidden for decades. Former Luftwaffe pilots began recounting times when they had spared enemy crews, and American bomber crews shared similar acts of mercy. A hidden layer of the war emerged, one not defined by statistics, bombs dropped, or territories gained, but by human choice. In private, Franz often thought about the war in ways few could understand. He mourned the friends he'd lost, the cities that were destroyed, the moral compromises he and others were forced to make. But he also took solace in knowing that in at least one moment, he had acted correctly. That decision, to spare the lives of 9 young men, gave him a lifeline back to his own humanity. Charlie Brown, too, revisited the flight in his dreams. He imagined the bomber spiraling, engines dead, crew frozen with fear, and the Messerschmitt appearing beside them like an angel of mercy. Those memories were never traumatic in the usual sense. Instead, they were bittersweet reminders of survival and grace. Every time he told the story, he felt a sense of duty to honor not only Franz's choice, but the resilience of his own crew. In the decades following their reunion, they traveled together to memorials, museums, and schools. They showed pictures of Ye Old Pub, of Franz's Bf 109, of the fragile line between life and death that had stretched across the clouds of northern Germany. They spoke of the psychological weight of war, the challenge of following orders versus the call of conscience, and the strange intimacy that exists between pilots in the sky, even when they're enemies. Historians later noted that Franz Stigler's actions were not an anomaly, but an example of what could happen when humanity asserted itself in the midst of brutality. Scholars debated, students wrote papers, and documentaries examined the code of the skies, the unwritten ethics that guided some pilots even in the heart of war. Franz's story became a touchstone, a reminder that morality and conscience are powerful forces capable of defying the machinery of war itself.
Even in retirement, Franz lived modestly, often flying small planes for pleasure, revisiting the skies he loved as a boy. He sometimes traced the same routes he had flown in wartime, imagining that day in December 1943 over northern Germany. And each time, he remembered the crew of Ye Olde Pub, their fear, their perseverance, and the unspoken bond forged by a single act of mercy. Charlie Brown, too, revisited the flight in his dreams. He imagined the bomber spiraling, engines dead, crew frozen with fear, and the Messerschmitt appearing beside them like an angel of mercy. Those memories were never traumatic in the usual sense. Instead, they were bittersweet reminders of survival and grace. Every time he told the story, he felt a sense of duty to honor not only Franz's choice, but the resilience of his own crew. In the decades following their reunion, they traveled together to memorials, museums, and schools. They showed pictures of Ye Olde Pub, of Franz's Bf 109, of the fragile line between life and death that had stretched across the clouds of northern Germany. They spoke of the psychological weight of war, the challenge of following orders versus the call of conscience, and the strange intimacy that exists between pilots in the sky, even when they are enemies. Historians later noted that Franz Stigler's actions were not an anomaly, but an example of what could happen when humanity asserted itself in the midst of brutality. Scholars debated, students wrote papers, and documentaries examined the code of the skies, the unwritten ethics that guided some pilots, even in the heart of war. Franz's story became a touchstone, a reminder that morality and conscience are powerful forces capable of defying the machinery of war itself. And so the legacy of that December day endures, not as a footnote in military records, not as a forgotten act, but as a lesson that courage, morality, and humanity are intertwined. A man chose not to obey. A bomber crew survived. A friendship blossomed from the skies of war.
One could argue that in the annals of history, moments like these are rare, but they are real, and they matter. They remind us that no matter the chaos, one person's conscience can alter the course of lives, and perhaps even the course of history. Because at the end of the day, history is made not only by victories and defeats, but by the choices of those willing to act with compassion when no one else will. Even as the years passed, the war never truly left Franz Stigler's mind. He thought often about the thousands of missions he had flown, the air battles that had claimed countless lives, and the friends who never returned. Yet, amid all that destruction, one memory remained vivid. The B-17, crippled and limping through the December sky, and the 9 young men inside, fighting to survive. That single choice, to spare them, became the defining moment of his life. Franz sometimes wondered if he had been naive. Could he have survived the war if he had followed orders without hesitation? Would obedience have earned him fame, medals, or a decorated place in the annals of the Luftwaffe? Perhaps, but fame never called to him. Instead, conscience called, and that call had led to something far greater than recognition. It had preserved the humanity in both him and the men he spared. He often thought about the moral paradox of war. Orders demanded ruthlessness, the system rewarded kill counts, yet there existed an unwritten law, the law of mercy. It was fragile, fleeting, and rare. For Stigler, recognizing that law and following it had been terrifying. One wrong move and he could have faced court-martial, even execution. Yet the weight of that one unfired shot outweighed any fear. Charlie Brown, in contrast, carried the gratitude of survival like a sacred responsibility. He spoke of the flight countless times, not to glorify himself, but to honor the unseen hand of mercy that had guided them home. In letters and speeches, he reminded younger generations that courage is sometimes found not in the bullets you fire, but in the restraint you exercise. That lesson, born in a sky torn by war, transcended time. Their reunion in Vancouver did more than reconcile two former enemies. It ignited a conversation about morality,
conscience, and the human cost of obedience. Journalists asked Franz why he had acted as he did. He replied simply, "I could not see them as the enemy. They were men, and men deserve life, even in war." Simple words, yet they carried the weight of decades of reflection, guilt, and grace. Franz and Charlie's friendship became an emblem of post-war reconciliation. They visited schools, veterans halls, and aviation museums. They told stories of courage, not in terms of victories and medals, but in human choice. They emphasized that war tests more than strategy. It tests character, integrity, and the capacity for empathy. Their talks were peppered with humor, tears, and the quiet wisdom of men who had seen humanity at its worst and best. Over time, their story reached a wider audience. The book, A Higher Call, chronicled their experiences, painting a detailed portrait of moral courage in the midst of chaos. Documentaries highlighted the fragile beauty of those moments in the sky, contrasting the brutality of war with the grace of mercy. Historians began to examine not just the tactics of aerial combat, but the ethics of engagement, inspired by Stigler's choice. Stigler's legacy extended beyond his own life. Pilots, both military and civilian, often cited his story as an example of integrity under pressure. Veterans reflected on moments when they had spared lives, hidden compassion, or defied orders in the name of humanity. In classrooms, students debated the moral implications of war, learning that courage is not always defined by aggression, but by restraint. Even in their final years, Franz and Charlie remained close. They would meet, sometimes silently watching the sky, remembering that cold December day over northern Germany. No words were necessary, just the shared memory of a fragile bomber, a fighter plane, and a choice that echoed far beyond the clouds. The world had changed, nations had rebuilt, but that moment remained frozen in time, a testament to the enduring power of conscience.
Franz Stigler passed away in 2008, leaving behind a family, friends, and a legacy of courage. Only months later, Charlie Brown followed, as if the sky itself had called them home together. Their lives had been shaped by war, but defined by mercy. The bond they formed became an enduring symbol. Even in the darkest times, humanity can prevail. Today, the story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown is more than a historical anecdote. It is a lesson in ethics, a study in bravery, and a reminder that one person's choice can ripple across decades. It teaches that morality matters, even when orders, ideology, or fear push in the opposite direction. That fragile moment in the sky, one man refusing to obey, continues to inspire, educate, and challenge us. It challenges us to ask ourselves, what would we do if faced with the same decision? Could we act with courage, with integrity, with compassion? Would we risk our lives, our reputations, our futures for the sake of another? Franz Stigler answered yes, and in doing so, changed history not through war, but through conscience. This story, so remarkable in its simplicity, reminds us that heroism is not always about victory, medals, or recognition. Sometimes it is about the quiet, invisible decisions, the ones that preserve life when destruction seems easier, the ones that honor humanity even in inhuman circumstances. And in the end, that is the victory that lasts forever. The other members of Ye Olde Pub's crew also carried the memory of that flight for the rest of their lives. Each man had faced death that day in December 1943, and each had felt the unspoken presence of a German fighter, not as an enemy, but as a guardian. They recounted later how the Messerschmitt had flown beside them, silent, almost protective, like a shadow of conscience in a world gone mad. Mechanics at the airfield who examined the bomber after its miraculous return found more than 200 bullet holes, a shattered tail, and engines struggling to stay alive. Yet all 9 crew members had survived. They often said among themselves that the invisible hand of fate had guided them, unaware that it was one man's moral courage that had saved them. Franz Stigler's restraint had transformed the bomber from an object of war into a vessel of survival. Over the years, the crew reunited several times.
often reflecting on the miracle they had experienced. They discussed the fear, the cold, the despair, but also the strange sense of awe they felt when the Messerschmitt appeared beside them. Some called it providence, others a miracle. Historians would later call it an extraordinary act of chivalry. But the men themselves always credited the unseen pilot, the one who had made the impossible choice to protect them. Meanwhile, historians began examining the psychological and ethical dimensions of air combat. Franz Stiegler's decision became a case study in moral courage, one that challenged the traditional narratives of war. Scholars asked, could such acts of humanity exist in modern warfare, where technology often distances the combatant from the consequences of their actions? Could soldiers and pilots resist orders when their conscience demanded it? The story of the Messerschmitt and Ye Olde Pub became a touchstone for these debates. For Stiegler, however, the academic attention was almost secondary. His legacy was lived in quiet acts, mentoring younger pilots, guiding students, speaking at reunions, and maintaining the bond with Charlie Brown. In their correspondence, they reflected on how war forces individuals to choose between obedience and morality, and how one choice can ripple across lifetimes. We were two young men in a vast war, but one moment of mercy made all the difference.
Charlie Brown, in turn, used the story to advocate for a more humane understanding of history. He often emphasized that history is not only shaped by battles won or lost, but by decisions made in the moment, decisions that reveal character, ethics, and humanity. In lectures to cadets and aviation students, he would describe the December flight in detail: the freezing wind, the crippled engines, the wounded men, and the Messerschmitt flying beside them, an angel of mercy in uniform. Their story also challenged post-war stereotypes of the enemy. Franz Stiegler, once seen as a part of the ruthless Luftwaffe, became an emblem of what individuals can do when they refuse to conform blindly. The encounter demonstrated that even amidst the machinery of war, individual moral agency could prevail. It encouraged generations of veterans and civilians alike to reconsider the complexity of human choice during wartime. Museums began featuring exhibits of Ye Olde Pub and Stiegler's Messerschmitt, showcasing the planes alongside narratives of mercy and conscience. Students and visitors marveled at the reality that one pilot's decision could outweigh hundreds of bullets, thousands of orders, and countless expectations. The exhibits reminded people that war is not only about strategy and destruction, but about human decisions that define the course of history. In Canada, Stiegler's neighbors and friends grew to understand the quiet heroism he embodied. He was never loud about his past, but those who knew him described him as a man of profound principle. He taught that true courage often manifests not in dramatic acts of aggression, but in the restraint of power, the defense of the vulnerable, and the choice to uphold morality even when it comes at personal risk. In the United States, Charlie Brown's advocacy created a ripple effect. Veterans and civilians alike were inspired by the notion that ethical action in war is possible, that mercy can coexist with duty, and that human compassion can persist even amidst the most brutal circumstances. Brown's talks, letters, and interviews ensured that the story of Franz Stiegler was preserved not just as history, but as a living moral lesson. The impact of their story continues even today. Military ethics courses reference the flight. Pilots discuss the principles of restraint in combat simulations. The story is cited in debates about the rules of engagement and the responsibilities of soldiers and commanders alike. One man's choice not to obey orders has influenced generations, reminding them that ethics and conscience are as vital as strategy and skill. As decades passed, memorials dedicated to acts of wartime humanity began to appear. The December 20th, 1943 flight was recognized not for its combat success, but for its moral significance. The surviving crew members and their families would often attend these ceremonies, sharing their gratitude, remembering their lost friends, and celebrating the pilot who had saved them through courage and conscience. Franz Stiegler's life, once defined by obedience and aerial victories, had ultimately been defined by restraint, empathy, and moral courage. And Charlie Brown's life, once defined by survival in the face of impossible odds,
have been shaped by the recognition that the greatest debts of honor are often owed to those we least expect, the ones who show mercy when cruelty is easier. The story remains timeless because it transcends war. It transcends nationality, ideology, and even generations. It teaches a lesson that applies to all human conflict, that morality matters, that conscience can triumph over orders, and that one moment of courage can redefine countless lives.
Every time someone walks past the battered fuselage of Ye Olde Pub or looks at the silhouette of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 in a museum, they are reminded. Victory is not always measured in destruction, and heroism is not always measured in medals. Sometimes it is measured in the courage to choose life over death, mercy over obedience, and humanity over hatred. That day in December 1943, Franz Stigler's refusal to obey became more than a story. It became a moral legend, a human compass, and a reminder that even amidst the horrors of war, light can prevail. That single act of conscience continues to inspire, teach, and guide. It is a story that asks a question of every one of us. When faced with the choice between duty and morality, which will we choose? As time went on, the story of Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown became more than history. It became a beacon. Families of veterans told their children about the flight, not just for its miraculous survival, but for the lesson it carried, that even in times of war, humanity can survive. Schools taught it as part of ethics discussions. Pilots remembered it as an example of moral courage above skill or rank. And historians, for all their charts, maps, and battle reports, came to recognize it as a rare moment when conscience overrode orders, a moment that proved the sky could be a place of mercy, not only destruction. Franz Stigler himself never sought recognition. He never claimed the fame that might have come from being a good German pilot. Instead, he lived quietly, content in the knowledge that he had done the right thing. The war had taken many things from him, his youth, his homeland, his friends, but it had not taken his humanity. That he had preserved, and in doing so, had changed the lives of others forever. Charlie Brown carried the gratitude of that day for the rest of his life. He often said that no medal, no honor could ever match the debt he owed to the man who had spared him and his crew. Their friendship, forged in the skies over Germany, lasted decades, a testament to what can grow when people choose compassion over conflict. When both men passed away in 2008, just months apart, the world lost more than two veterans. It lost two living symbols of moral courage, two men who proved that even in the darkest of times, a single act of conscience can shine brighter than any battlefield victory. Today, the story of Franz Stigler's refusal to obey resonates as much as ever. Museums, books, documentaries, and lessons in moral courage keep it alive. Pilots, students, historians, and ordinary people learn from it that heroism is not only about fighting, but about knowing when not to. That sometimes the most powerful choice a person can make is to protect life instead of taking it. The flight of December 20th, 1943 was brief, just minutes in the cold gray skies over northern Germany. Yet those minutes changed lives, forged friendships, and left a legacy that transcends generations. A German fighter pilot, once poised to kill, chose mercy. A bomber crew, on the brink of destruction, survived. And decades later, the two men met, reconciled, and reminded the world of something far greater than war: the enduring power of human conscience. In the end, that is what history remembers. Not the medals, not the destruction, not the ideology. It remembers the choice, the quiet, terrifying, courageous decision to do what was right. And it serves as a reminder for all of us in all times, even when the world demands obedience, there is always room for conscience. Franz Stigler's story is a story of conscience, courage, and humanity. It teaches us that mercy can prevail, that one person's choice can echo across decades,
and that true heroism lies not in destruction, but in the preservation of life. And that, ultimately, is the legacy of a man who refused to obey, and in doing so, showed the world what it truly means to be human.